Matthew. Okay, so the book of Matthew. And for many of us, we've been looking at Matthew on a Sunday, and we've reached the point where we are looking at the Gethsemane narrative. Jesus in the garden, where he first of all struggles and then submits. That Gethsemane narrative in Matthew 26, we'll take a look at later on, and we'll take our last look at that Gethsemane narrative. But let's think first of all about the Gospels as a whole. Then we'll think about Matthew as a book, and then we'll focus on the Gethsemane narrative at the close. So if we think of the Gospels as a whole, then we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew and Luke both build on the Gospel of Mark. So Mark is first, and the material in Mark feeds both into Matthew and into Luke's account. And many of us will know that Mark is Peter's memories, Peter's experiences with Jesus Christ. So Mark comes first. Mark is foundational in telling us about the time Jesus was with us. And then Matthew goes off in one direction, and he's very concerned about Jewish Christians and the Jewish tradition. Luke then his perspective is ostensibly to write a defense for Theophilus. But Luke's concern is primarily to demonstrate the compassion of God in the person of Jesus Christ. Theophilus, the person to whom Luke is writing, may or may not have been an actual person. The tradition is that he was in court, if he is an actual person, that he was in court and this was a defense document. But many think that this was a construct. This was a way of putting Luke's material together. And if you take the name Theophilus, you've got Theos, which is God, Phileo, which is one of the words for love. And so it's the idea of loving God because he first loved us. So Luke is very concerned about compassion. Those three Gospels are known as the Synoptic Gospels. They take a very similar point of view. And then, of course, you have John's Gospel, which stands on its own and was the last book to be written in the New Testament. So Gabby said to us a while ago, could we have one word to hang each of the books of the Bible on? I'm going to give you one word to hang the whole of the Gospels on. Okay, so if you wish to remember the idea of the Gospels, think of the word fact. Matthew's Gospel, the letter F, Matthew emphasizes fulfillment. And you'll have again and again throughout Matthew's Gospel how Christ is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. Then if you take the letter A, Mark's Gospel is very much a gospel of action. Mark doesn't give us the ancestry of Jesus. He doesn't emphasize the teachings of Jesus. He's primarily giving us the events, the acts of the Lord Jesus Christ. And then we've already said, C, compassion. That's Luke's focus. The compassion of Christ on the outcast, on the unwell, on the possessed, on women and slaves and even Roman officials. It's the compassion of God in action through Christ. And you see that in the parables that Luke teaches, especially the parable that we call the parable of the prodigal son, but of course that's the parable about God and his nature. And then finally T, the letter T, and we can take that letter T and have the word theology, and John's Gospel is very theologically minded. John takes an eternal perspective. He discusses the eternal nature of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the Word of God, the Word that became flesh, pitched his tent amongst us, and fulfilled what was foreseen in Moses and Elijah. So theology is very much John's perspective. So the word fact, we have fulfillment, action, compassion, theology. that's a way of capturing the Gospels in the New Testament. So let's come to Matthew then specifically. And if we think of the structure of Matthew's Gospel, it's got quite a nice and easy structure to hold in mind. So you get an introduction, no surprise there, okay? Chapter 1, verse 1, all the way through to chapter 4 and verse 16 is the introduction to this Gospel. And it's a huge and really important introduction. You get the ancestry, and we've looked at that over the years together, the shape of the ancestry, the significance of the ancestry. Then you get the birth narratives, and we were looking at the birth narratives up until the end of last year. And the surprise for all of us when we looked at those birth narratives is that they are salvation stories. They are stories of how Jesus was saved. Whilst in the womb of Mary, he was saved. As a young boy, he was saved from Herod. Do you remember? So those birth narratives are salvation stories. And then as you just flick through the introduction, chapters 2, 3, and 4, we have preparation in the story of John the Baptist. And then you have the temptation of Jesus. And Jesus there is a second Adam, being tempted as Adam was, succeeding where Adam failed, being tempted in the wilderness that is a metaphor for human experience. And in that wilderness, standing in our place, he then is successful as he resists Satan. And you then have the beginning of the first section of Matthew's Gospel, chapter 4 and verse 17. That's where the first section begins, okay? And you may remember the phrase that introduces the first section, verse 17, from that time, Jesus began to preach, okay? So here we have the first section of the Gospel. It's referred to as a preaching section. We'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, okay? That's the first section of the Gospel. And then as you go across to chapter 16, which we know is a very significant chapter, you have the confession from Peter that Jesus is the Christ. You have the second section of the Gospel, okay? So you should be now in chapter 16. And in chapter 16, you look at verse 21 and look at the phrase you've got in verse 21. From that time, Jesus began to show. Okay? So the first section, from that time, Jesus began to teach. And then the second section of the Gospel, from that time, Jesus began to show. Now, what was he showing? The word is to reveal. And of course, Jesus began to reveal his mission to go to the cross. He began to reveal that he would be betrayed, that he would be arrested, that he would be crucified, and that he would be raised on the third day. So take a look at verse 21 of Matthew 16. From that time, Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised the third day. So there's a statement that captures all that is going to follow now in the rest of this gospel. The unfolding, the means by which Jesus will be nailed to the cross, and how he will be raised from the dead. And of course, Peter immediately resists what Jesus is beginning to show. And the writer, we think is Matthew, others disagree. The writer will develop the idea of the disciples and their role in what Jesus is showing them. And of course, there'll be times when they will resist, and ultimately they will abandon Christ as he fulfills this great purpose of going to Jerusalem and going to the cross. So that's the second part of the gospel. And then, of course, it ends with the account of the resurrection. So there's the structure. It's quite easy. Introduction, section 1, section 2, conclusion. Okay? Now, in amongst the gospel then, we have 5 discourses. Now, I wish there was a better word. I think the word discourse is just horrid. You can have the idea of speeches, 5 moments when Jesus teaches, if you like, okay? Whatever word you want to use, this gospel has 5 blocks of Jesus speaking on his own, either to the disciples or to the crowds that follow him. And these 5 moments in the gospel are often compared to the 5 books at the beginning of the Old Testament. So some people see Matthew as a book that builds on the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Genesis, and fulfills them in the person of Christ. So some would say that Matthew is a new Pentateuch, it's a new law, if you like, whatever. But because of this idea of 5 chunks of Jesus talking, discoursing, there's often that comparison made. So let me point out to you the 5 discourses then that we have in Matthew. The first of them is probably the best known of them, and is Matthew 5 to 7, what we often know as the Sermon on the Mount. Let me leave you with something to think about here, okay? What's the purpose of the Sermon on the Mount? Very well known. We like chapter 6 and the teaching on anxiety, about not being anxious. We like the way it ends with building on the rock, which is Jesus Christ, and the flood, and the wise and the foolish man. What do you think is the purpose then of this sermon? It begins with those Beatitudes, do you remember? Blessed are the pure in heart, blessed are the meek, and so on, blessed are the peacemakers. What I'd like you to do is reflect on what you think is the purpose of this sermon. Okay, so that's the first of the discourses that you find in Matthew's Gospel. Go across to chapter 10 and you get the second. And the second of the discourses are known as the mission discourses. It's the whole idea of sending out the 12, what they'll face, persecution, the need to confess Christ, and the result of confessing Christ. And the result of confessing Christ will be division. And families will be divided. And it's about how when you are engaged in mission, you are living out the incarnation. Jesus, the Son of God, come amongst us. In mission, you live out who he is. So that's the second of these discourses. Okay, still with me? Go across to the third of them. And the third discourse is chapter 13. And again, something to think about here. This is known as the parable discourse. And the disciples themselves will ask, won't they, what's the purpose of parables? So Jesus teaches in parables, the parable of the sower, and the disciples will say to him, why don't you speak more clearly? Look at verse 10 of Matthew 13. The disciples came and said to him, why do you speak to them in parables? It's a great question, and it's a question that's been asked down through the history of the church. Why does Jesus teach in parable form? And many people have misunderstood, I think, the purpose of parables, and they'll say things like, oh, well, Jesus was a great teacher, and he was using illustrations from everyday life to give spiritual meanings, or he's proving that you must have stories in your sermons and you've got to use illustrations. Well, that's not how I understand the purpose of parables. And Jesus will quote, won't he? If you look down into chapter 13, look at verses 14 and 15. He quotes from Isaiah, and he tells you very clearly what's the purpose of parables. And of course, the purpose of parables is not to illuminate what he's teaching. So if you like, the purpose of parables is not to shine a light on the content or the subject of Jesus's teaching. The purpose of parables is to shine a light on the human heart and to show the darkness in the human heart. That even when you make a spiritual statement, even when you're teaching the message of God in its most simple form, men and women will still not understand it. They will still not make sense of it. They can still not believe it. So a parable doesn't shine a light on the teaching. A parable shines a light on the human condition. And what's the human condition like? Okay, let's go to discourse number 4, and it's Matthew 18. And in Matthew 18, you get one of the great words of the New Testament. Surprising to find it in Matthew 18. You really wouldn't expect it to be there, but it is. And it's the word church. And so what we have in Matthew 18 is the notion of the church, or the discourse about the church, the gathered community. Now, ecclesia, the Greek word for church, it's borrowed from Greek culture. It means an assembly, a gathering together. Of course, in Greek culture, it was for political purposes, but that word is then taken and incorporated into the Christian tradition. The church, the gathered community, those who've been called out. Ek, like in Exodus, out from, and then kaleo, to call. So the church is the called out ones, those whom God has called out from humanity in general. He's called them out to be his people. Like Israel were called out from Egypt, men and women are called out from their darkness and formed into the church, which is not a building, and it's not even a group of people meeting in a building. The church are those men and women who have been called by God. And when we think about the church, we talk about the gathered community. It's an invisible community because we may have 10 people meeting together, but it may not be that those 10 people are part of the church. The church is known to God. So the church is an invisible body whom God calls from human experience, if you like. So that's Matthew 18. And then everyone, we got the last of the discourses. The longest and the scariest. Matthew 23, 24, 25, and 26. Okay? And these are very difficult to understand. It's sometimes known as the Olivet Discourse, Mount of Olives. And what you have here is Jesus talking about the end times, persecutions, judgment, readiness for judgment, faithfulness during the idea of judgment, the Son of God then coming to judge the nations. So it's a huge discourse filled with fear and drama and judgment and end and so on. So it's a discourse that we've never looked at together, and perhaps we will do now at some point. Okay, so those are the 5 discourses: Sermon on the Mount, mission, parables, church, and then this final all-encompassing idea of judgment and the end and readiness for judgment. Okay, so that's the structure of Matthew's Gospel. And do you remember when we began to look at this together in our fellowship, we started with what we described as a key. I'm sure you know this, so let's just remind ourselves of it. In chapter 1, when you have the birth narratives, and these birth narratives build on the Old Testament stories, and very much like the Joseph stories, we have dreams. And in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 1, Joseph has a dream. And in that dream, we read that the angel speaks to him. And Matthew then puts his own spin, doesn't he? Puts his own take on things. Matthew 1:23, behold, the virgin shall be with child and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which is translated God with us. Matthew is the story of God with us. This unborn baby in Mary's womb is God with us. This baby whom Joseph has to protect from Herod is God with us. The one in the desert being tempted is God with us. And of course, the one who then is betrayed and arrested is God with us. So the whole key to Matthew's Gospel is making sense of the fact that this person we are reading about is God with us, the God who was drawn near to us. And again, I've tried to emphasize, haven't I, with you, that the Christian message is not us reaching up to God. It's not us trying to draw near to God. It is God who reaches down, who comes down to us and takes our very nature and adds human nature to himself and becomes one with us and lives amongst us and is tested like we are. It is the incarnation, God coming down. One of the things to remember there is in our Christian experience, when we're not feeling very good about ourselves as Christians, we often say we've got to get closer to God. And we want to be nearer to God. And I understand perfectly why we do that. But it's not about us having some kind of spatial relationship to God in which we can be far or near, distant or close. The Christian message is God is with us. God comes to us. Christ lives in us. The Holy Spirit dwells in us. So we cannot get any closer to God than we always are, because God is in us and has come to us. Okay? So Emmanuel, the key to unlock the gospel. So let's finish then. I think time's gone really quickly today with another look, the last look that we have at the Gethsemane narrative. Okay? So we're in Matthew 26. And the Gethsemane narrative is 36 to 56. And we've said many times now that this Gethsemane narrative falls into two. You have the struggle and the prayer in the garden. That's the first part of the narrative, 36 to 46. Now, we've looked at that in lots of different ways. And we last looked at it together on Sunday night. And then you get the second half of the narrative, verses 47 to 56. This is the arrest of Jesus in the garden. And let's just read it then. So Matthew 26, 47. While he was still speaking, behold. Now, you know, don't you? That's a key word for Matthew. He takes the word behold and he builds his narrative around it. We have 4 beholds in the birth narratives. We have one behold that stands on its own. Behold the star. So this word is crucial for Matthew. And if it's in the birth narratives, we're going to see it now, the same word, as we come to an end. So behold, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude, with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now his betrayer, now why does Matthew name Judas and then call him his betrayer? Had given them, a sign saying, whomever I kiss, he is the one, seize him. So straight away then he went up to Jesus and said, greetings, teacher, and kissed him. But Jesus said, friend, why have you come? And so the crowds came and laid hands on Jesus and took him, arrested him. And suddenly one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword, struck the servant of the high priest, and cut off his ear. Jesus said to them, "Put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Now, don't you think that even now I cannot pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels? How then could the scriptures be fulfilled that it must happen thus?" In that hour, Jesus said to the multitudes, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? I sat daily with you teaching in the temple, and you did not arrest me. But all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then the disciples forsook him and fled. All of us have got the tools we need to unlock that arrest narrative. Look at the repetition. There's the repetition of the idea of Jesus as a robber and a thief. There's the repetition of the phrase that the scriptures might be fulfilled. Verse 54, how then could the scriptures be fulfilled? Jesus says to his disciples, and then to the crowd, verse 56. But all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. He hasn't got a specific scripture in mind there. He's talking about all the prophets and all the scriptures that pointed forward to him. So this arrest is understood by Jesus to be the fulfillment of everything that has gone before. The whole witness of the Old Testament, not just specific verses or even specific themes, but the whole witness of the Old Testament is now fulfilled in this moment when Emmanuel is arrested. And so just look and notice these kind of repetitions. And then you've got a very interesting verse in verse 52. And it's a kind of verse that we've already seen. So look at verse 52. Put your sword in its place. And then you've got this phrase. All who take the sword will perish by the sword. That phrase is a commonplace saying. It's not, I don't know how to put this. It's not, strictly speaking, scriptural. It's ordinary. It's an ordinary phrase. And it's a truism, something that is true of life in general. And we've had it, that kind of statement already when Jesus was anointed at Bethany. Do you remember at the beginning of chapter 26? And in verse 11, Jesus says there, the poor you will always have with you. Again, it's a truism. It's a fact of life. We will always have the poor. And in the same way, those who use violence will be affected by violence. The use of violence has an impact on the one who is violent. So Jesus, at this crucial time, is drawing people's attention to the way that life is and the way that life goes. Jesus is no exemption to the ordinariness of life. The commonplace nature of life impacts him as much as it does anyone else. So he's arrested, and of course, in verse 56, let's finish with this. When he says that in this moment, the whole witness of the Old Testament reaches its fulfillment, you then get this statement without any comment at all, don't you, by Matthew? Then all the disciples forsook him and fled. And of course, that too is a fulfillment of the Old Testament witness. In Zechariah, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. So without any comment, Matthew simply states that at this great climax to the whole thrust and direction of God's revelation so far. It goes exactly as God has purposed. This is no tragedy. It's no mistake. It's not failure. It is the grand climax of all the purposes of God witnessed to over the centuries. And so what we'll do Sunday night is we'll take a look at the trial of Jesus as Matthew tells us in 26 and 27. Just notice that Matthew gives very little attention to Pilate. His emphasis is on the Jewish nature of the trial of Jesus. And Matthew's audience are the Jews, aren't they? The Jewish people. And so he emphasizes the Jewish nature of the trial that Jesus experiences. And he tells us things that only Matthew tells us, very interestingly. And then we'll make our way, as we lead up to Easter, to the crucifixion itself. So that's the Gospel of Matthew.